Welcome to Statistical Correlation and Data Bullshit. I'm your hostess, Crazy Aunt Nay. Today we will learn how to tell if information in the form of the numbers or the data is true or false. We'll use our critical thinking skills to dissect this slowly and decide for ourselves if we can trust what is being presented to us, or if it's totally invalid. We'll also learn the tricks people use to baffle you with bullshit, using statistics and data analysis to bully you and present something as factual that is not. It's important to be able to identify this for yourself, so let's get going. First and foremost, as we learned before, approach every situation every time from a cynical mindset. Remember, this doesn't mean thinking negatively. It means don't believe it until we get to the end of our process. Until you have concluded for yourself it's trustworthy, then it's not. There's another saying that can help here too, in addition to talking about the smell test. That is, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. This is kind of a short version of the scientific process. The most important part of this saying is at the end. The conclusion is not stated absolute. It says, then it's probably a duck. This is an example of Occam's razor that we discussed in the scientific process. It's basically saying the simplest explanation is probably the correct one. But it is not absolute and leaves room for additional information that could possibly change the outcome. This is always true if you're actually doing science. New information and knowledge could change the conclusion, and science will always allow for drawing a new hypothesis. Never believe anyone's numbers or conclusions unless they can show you the math and the data that backs up how they arrived at that conclusion. If they can't or won't show you, they are probably trying to baffle you with bullshit. Here are several things to watch out for. These are the most common things I run into over and over. Number one, statistics. What is it? Statistics is a branch of mathematics dealing with the collection, analysis, interpretation, and presentation of masses of numerical data. It is critical to understand that in order for any statistic to be valid, several things must be true. Sample size is usually the one that fails scrutiny. Sample size must be a valid percentage of the whole in order to draw any conclusions from that data. If you sample 2 people out of 1,000,000, that is not a valid sample size. Watch for the plus or minus margin of error. Under the bell curve, we have learned, if your plus or minus margin of error is 2, it doesn't change the conclusion much. But if it's 20%, you could go from the 80-20 rule to 40-60 real quick. So then it's clearly less valid. Also, if someone is talking about a percentage ever, be very leery. Again, if you have low numbers of response, you survey 100 people and 9 respond, but your statement says 80% of respondents believe X. What does that mean? That means 7 of the 9 people responded that way, in that particular way. But you cannot conclude that it is true or valid to say that it is representative of the 100. But that's exactly what people do. In fact, they do worse. If the 100 was going to be a valid sample size to draw a conclusion on 10,000, then they take the 7 people who responded as representative of 10,000. That's what people do all the damn time. Then suckers lap it up and believe it and turn it into soundbite arguments of stupid. Even more concerning is when people present data as having a correlation to other data, when there is no correlation whatsoever. We'll go into this as we go along with examples that will make it clearer. Number 2, data manipulation. This would be when someone reporting data has intentionally manipulated the base data in order to drive a desired outcome. Let's say someone isn't getting the result they want from the data, so they can assert their predetermined conclusion. Well, they just go and fraudulently change the base data, then state it as true. If you think that is outlandish and no one does that, think again. This is extremely common. So how do we know if this is being done? Do your own study or look for a second study that corroborates it. If it can't be corroborated or they don't show you their process, including how they gathered said data, don't believe it. Start mocking these people. They should feel shame for their stupid attempt to manipulate innocent people who will believe them. Number 3, government malfeasance. Governments intentionally changing regulatory framework to manipulate data, either directly or indirectly to support a political or subjective opinion. If you think this doesn't happen, you're also crazy. I will give you 2 recent examples below, and we will look at some other examples of how to apply critical thinking to identify these issues. You all remember COVID, right? The beginning of the end of your future America, if the commies have their way. Some of you are pretty young still, but do you remember all the hubbub about the government ordering the medical industry to change the way they count deaths? For hundreds of years, death certificates and cause of death were based on the thing that actually caused the demise of the person. During COVID, the government was not getting strong enough data to support their predetermined position that COVID was dangerous for all people, and so we should all be very afraid. So they ordered the medical profession to change how they reported cause of death. Instead of listing a person who died from a motorcycle crash they were in that caused blunt force trauma to their head, now they had to test them post-mortem. That means after they've died. And if they had the COVID virus in their blood, they had to report cause of death as COVID. Yes, this really happened. Why do you think they wanted to do that? This caused 2 obvious issues. Most obvious is that now you are getting over-reporting of the actual problem. More people dying of COVID than were actually dying of COVID. But worse is that it eliminated base data. What is base data? Base data is an established data collection or source in the past that allows you to compare your current data in order to measure things and outcomes. By destroying the ability to compare causes of death with prior years, for years and years and years, we couldn't see if deaths caused by COVID were higher or lower, or if they were in line with influenza deaths from prior years, etc. In other words, now they can make up whatever they want to say about what that data means and get idiots to believe it and repeat it. The more people heard the lie, the more afraid they became of this mysterious virus. This is only one example of the government data malfeasance during COVID. There are many more examples. Another example of government manipulating data to get a desired result is what a California State Department did with transgender data. This is a little complex and detailed, so I'm just going to give it to you at a very high level, but we'll dive into it deeper in a future episode. When transgender medicine was first becoming a thing, the Department of Managed Healthcare wanted to drive the narrative that it was settled medicine and that there was a legitimate industry standard. Not only was this a lie and the data did not substantiate what they were saying, but the data was actually starting to show they were wrong. There is a thing called independent medical review, or IMR for short. This is where if you get a service denied by your health plan for any reason, such as being experimental, you can request an IMR. What is supposed to be an objective or independent contracted party will review the case and make a determination of whether or not it should be provided, and they give a medical reason. Doctors in the same specialty are supposed to review these. So if you're getting something reviewed that requires toe surgery, you have a toe surgeon that reviews it, not an ears, nose, and throat guy, right? Should be the same type of a specialty. And they provide a medical reason. The decision is binding on the health plan. That means they cannot appeal or object. They must provide it if the ruling comes out that way. Beginning around 2016-ish or so, the department was upset because the data was not coming back the way they wanted it to, so they ordered the independent contractor to stop using medical doctors and surgeons to review these cases, and instead use only psychiatrists. These psychiatrists were not ruling on these from a medical standpoint. Instead, they were approving them all with the same words, identical phrases, just like cult speak, that essentially stated if the patient has been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, then anything they ask for is medically necessary and should be provided. After several years of this falsified data, they began to use it in court cases and attempted to legitimize the story in the legal system, which they did with great success. After their success with this, when COVID happened, they used these identical tactics and worse to manipulate the COVID data to tell a story they wanted told, not to tell the real story as science would. Now let's dissect another example. These charts show some population data. The story they claim this is conclusive evidence of is how America is becoming less white, with an undercurrent of white equals bad. The narrative is, as America becomes less white, we should celebrate it being less racist. There is also a narrative that if enough non-white people come to this country, the Democrats will be able to stay in power indefinitely because apparently they think if you're non-white, that guarantees you will vote Democrat. They used to say this about women too, but they don't anymore because it's bullshit. But what can we actually extract from this information? Looking at this graphic, what do we actually know? We know some dates and time. We know it's about white Americans because that's what the title at the top says. We know different percentages in different states at different times in history. We know an overall percentage of white for that year and an actual population number. We don't know if the population number is the same as the percentage. In other words, population of 1,083,000 is what we see. Does that mean the whole population of the US was 1,083,000 were white? Or is there 1 million white people that makes up 83% of the whole population, which would be a bigger number than 1 million? In the absence of explanation or facts, people lean on assumption. I don't know if your teachers taught you never to assume because it makes an ass out of you and me, but that is a fact you should never forget, especially when dealing with statistics and data bullshit. Never, ever assume anything. So this is all we know about this graphic. What they want you to assume, and the story they tell around this graphic, is that America is getting less white. They imply that is good and means less racist. They imply this demographics is destiny nonsense. That means as America gets less white, it will be less Republican, and ultimately the Democrats will have absolute power. That's the story. It's not my story. It's their story. They say it all over the news. It's all over. It's out there public. Go look. You can find it. They say it over and over. Although we can see the change over time, they do not give you enough information to explain what is happening to create this change. They don't mention that through history, especially modern history, the last 60 years or so, it has become very commonplace for people to marry and have families in mixed race homes in America. Although we are seeing the reduction of purely white in people, we are equally seeing the reduction of purely black people, purely Asian people, purely Hispanic people, and so on. This is showing a picture of a melting pot phenomenon. Another thing they don't mention is that in almost all demographic data collection, the government malfeasance has been to remove other as a choice and also to not allow the selection of more than one option. Therefore, if you are mixed race, you must pick only one. Then there has been messaging and education around which one you are allowed to pick. If you have any other race in you that you're aware of, you are only that and you cannot acknowledge the white part. In contrast, if you are white but feel it's too limiting because you see yourself as, say, an Anglo-American, Irish-American, Italian-American, you can only select white. There, interestingly, is also no selection that states just mixed race or American. Why do you think that is? What would happen to the story they want to tell if we had data sets that showed that information? This is an example of claiming a correlation in the data when there is none. All you can accurately say about this graphic is that it shows the percent of white-only demographics. Yet, more interestingly, they then claim that America and white people are racist. Well, if my story of what this graphic shows is true, and it is, then America must be the least racist country in all the world, because everyone is having babies with everyone else of all races, sizes, and creeds. That doesn't sound very racist, does it? Then they jump to the next false correlation, claiming this means America is also, by nature of being less white, it's also more Democrat and less Republican. That sounds pretty racist to me. So if you're any other race than white, including mixed race, you aren't likely to think for yourself and vote for yourself. In conclusion, don't believe any statistics or data that are served up to you without doing your thinking best, due diligence. Start by being cynical and not believing it until it is proven to be true. We'll look at many more examples of this as we dive into the episodes.